Hi, this is Tom Broussard. It is Tuesday, March 23rd, 2021. Nice to see everybody. Beautiful day up here in Maine. This new article is called Russian Dolls, the Nested Attributes of Aphasia and Recovery. This was a good article. I had a long time, I was thinking about this for a long time about Russian dolls, nested dolls. When I was young, I used them all the time. You get them at stores, parents give them to you, and you play with them all the time. And as I thought about my stroke and aphasia, I began to see some of the nested quality to these different deficits as I started thinking about them. And I began to see this Russian doll as a nested deficits. I really thought that it was all about the deficits going forward. And I always thought that the deficits were typically about reading, writing, and speaking, about those three big issues, modalities, as they say. And as I started studying my brain and understanding what was wrong, I began to see additional deficits within the deficits that I thought were already there. So the more I studied them, the more I practiced one kind of deficit or another, it appeared that more additional smaller deficits also started to appear. Again, these were deficits within deficits, and turns out deficits were all nested in my particular thought about it. The interesting thing was that the more I practiced, the more deficits I saw, but in the same, almost same thought, then the more I practiced and saw more deficits, those deficits started to appear and then disappear with more practice. So I began to understand that. Of course, when I say I began to understand, that's what I was thinking at the time. Not that I could write this down at the time, but I did save everything with my diary. So that at least gives you some of what I was thinking at the time. Not that the words would necessarily help you reading my diary, but you can see from my graphs, charts, and metaphorical drawings that clearly I was thinking about these various things, and you see a lot of intelligence with those graphs and charts, much more than the words that you saw with them. But as I thought my way through that, I began to understand that that the more I did practice, I was, quote, getting better because I was seeing more, quote, problems. And as I saw more problems, then as they appeared, they started to also disappear as I practiced more. So it's clearly this revolving door in terms of deficits and improvement based on who those deficits are and how those same cells can then work on those that are deficits and become more improved going forward. And that was all part of what I refer to as the active ingredients of practice, is this persistent, repetitive language activity. Again, I've said this before in many of my articles, I was still unaware that they were so therapeutic. People on the other side of that table, the therapists, know exactly that the more you do these A, B, and C types of things, then the more therapeutic they will be. But I think what they still need to do is help us understand earlier, better, that all these activities are highly therapeutic. It isn't just do these things, and yes, somehow you'll get better. Do these things. This is the reason why you'll get better. And if you do them more persistent, more repetitive, more intensively over time, the more you'll see the improvement. And I think we have to be told that, as it were. And if we've been told that, it was probably at a time when we're still unaware. Turns out that awareness has its own skill. Reading, writing, and speaking have their deficits. Awareness has its deficits too. And that takes a long time for you to become aware of those deficits laying in front of you. And again, if you don't save the evidence, I kept my diary, I recorded myself with my phone, I took pictures of the world around me. It turns out that saving the evidence and actually being able to see the evidence every day going forward, eventually I broke through on the awareness skill continuum. But it did take a lot of time, and that too is therapeutic in terms of the practice, not yet knowing that A, it's therapeutic, and B, that you will get better, including the awareness component, the more you practice what you're doing with those deficits of which you're not even necessarily aware until you continue to do the practice. I know it sounds somewhat reclusive, but that is the way it seems to be. But I really thought that my deficits were massive and monolithic, and that was what it was. If I couldn't read, I couldn't read at all, not really knowing that there were other components of our work and our therapy, and even unknown therapy, that were not monolithic, and that they had all kinds of other angles to get at the deficits that you could see. In my particular case, when it came to reading as an example, I knew I couldn't read. I could not read a sentence or a paragraph or an article or a book. It was just too hard. We can talk about that another time, but hard is an interesting brain-related sense of hard. But as I started walking around town and I could see the signs out on the street, I would see individual signs with one word, stop. And I could read stop. I knew what that meant. Speed limit. I could read that and knew what that meant. And as I took those pictures, the more things I saw that had more words to them, including lots of other bigger stores or restaurants, churches, plaques, the more I saw longer sentences, I could feel this difficulty, not able to read what are typically some pretty simple sentences. So at that point, I began to realize, oh, reading is one of those deficits that have other families of deficits down below, because I couldn't read the sentences, knowing that a lot of my deficits didn't have a whole lot to do with the words themselves, but the connectivity between one word or another. When it came to writing, I did lots of tests with my therapy, and they didn't have a lot to do with writing, but they were writing tests and exercises, and you would fill in words, draw lines connecting one word to an image. That was all part of the writing exercise. And and then because the therapist said, okay, I want you to now get on the computer and write something in the computer. And at that point, I would freeze at the computer. I would get as far as I, meaning I want to do something or another. I could only get to the I, and it just froze. And I do remember the therapist saying, okay, we'll wait for a couple weeks or a couple months, because it really wasn't until December, January that I began to be able to write on a computer. But when I went home every day in October, November, December, I was writing in my diary. I didn't show my SLP, but I was writing, excuse me, by longhand for myself quite fluently, not knowing that what I was writing didn't make any sense, but I saved the evidence that I was showing that it didn't make any sense. And nobody saw that until I became aware enough and looked at what I had seen and said, oh my goodness, who wrote this? It looks terrible. I thought it looked just fine. That's part of the awareness component of that. I thought it looked just fine. It was 11 months before I could tell that it was wrong, even though later you'd be able to see that I was improving along the way, but it looked fine at the beginning, fine at the end, not realizing that there was a trajectory of improvement from really looking bad to even normal humans, all the way to the end, where even I could see that it looked fine as I became more aware. And clearly I was, quote, doing better going forward. So it is interesting, again, looking at the deficits and the nested component of that, that the stroke can strike anywhere in the brain and affects the different modalities differently. There is no one shape of the deficits. It really does hit not just the individual words, but each of the individual components that create a word, and each of them are highly redundant anyway. So it really strikes them all over the place. And as they come together, then it affects the language one way or another within these different modalities and within the different nested deficits, as well as the ability they have to resolve those deficits down nested within the nested dolls of our language. So that was how it all began, to understand how the Russian doll as a metaphor with me, as I was considering what was wrong with me in the various modalities, and to the degree that the more I practiced without knowing that that practice was therapeutic, that I got to see more deficits. And as I watched more of those deficits and basically studied with the effort and the interest that contributes to plasticity in terms of the induced component of those activities, then they too began to disappear while in the process of figuring out what they were when I first saw them, in my case. So it is incredibly interesting that the real injury to our brain, the neurological injury to our brain, is the destruction of those millions and millions of cells, and the resultant loss, not so much, quote, of the words themselves, but the speed, connectivity, and the damage to the networks themselves. That is what's damaged, and the critical mass of each of those networks have to re-achieve the strength that they need neurologically, the strength that they need to be able to now be able to speak again, write again, hear again, understand again, with each of these very, 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 very small components that all really do come together to affect the deficits differently across various modalities. And that's why I say those skills and deficits are buried deep in the nested dolls of our language. Thank you all once again. I do appreciate getting the comments I get from my customers, as it were. And I do like this one about the nested doll, because I really did think when I started that my nested doll understanding, the metaphor of all that was really just the deficits. And I began to realize that the deficits really are one side of the same coin, and the other side being the ability to resolve those deficits based on the practice, based on the plasticity that comes as a result of A, understanding, becoming more aware of those deficits, and then B, attacking the deficits because you're now more aware. And as a result of that, the more aware you are of those deficits, the more you are able to, quote, see, attack those deficits as they get closer and closer to the bone of what is otherwise the overarching modality of reading, writing, and speaking, but still dealing with these individual ones going forward. And that was my understanding, was that it isn't just the deficits. We have our cells and our ability to realize what the deficits are and how we can resolve those deficits with the exact same cells and brain that are in the process of improving, doing the process of improvement. Thank you, everybody. I will see you again in 2 weeks. And we're just past spring, so we're coming close. And that'll be a lot of fun. I'll probably do a little bit less work this summer because we'll have more vacations and be able to do more things with more of our family and friends. So it's nice to see everybody. Take care. See you soon. Bye-bye.